1. When Sulla got possession of the supreme power, he confiscated the marriage portion of Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, who had once enjoyed the supremacy in Rome, because he could not either by promises or threats induce Caesar to part with her. The cause of the enmity between Caesar and Sulla was Caesar's relationship to Marius, for the elder Marius was the husband of Julia, the sister of Caesar's father, and Julia was the mother of the younger Marius, who was consequently Caesar's cousin. Caesar was not content with being let alone by Sulla, who was at first fully occupied with the prescriptions and other matters, but he presented himself to the people as a candidate for a priesthood, though he had hardly arrived at man's estate. But Sulla, by his opposition, contrived to exclude him from this office, and even thought of putting him to death. And when some observed that there was no reason in putting to death such a youth, Sulla observed that they had no sense if they did not see many Mariuses in this boy. These words were conveyed to Caesar, who thereupon concealed himself by wandering about for some time in the Sabine country. On one occasion, when he was changing his place of abode on account of sickness, he fell in by night with the soldiers of Sulla, who were scouring those parts and seizing on those who were concealed. But Caesar got away by giving Cornelius, who was in command of the soldiers, 2 talents, and going straightway down to the coast, he took ship and sailed to Bithynia, to King Nicomedes, with whom he stayed no long time. On his voyage from Bithynia, he was captured near the island Pharmacusa by pirates, who at that time were in possession of the seas with a powerful force and numerous ships. 2. The pirates asked Caesar 20 talents for his ransom, on which he laughed at them for not knowing who their prize was, and he promised to give them 50 talents. While he dispatched those about him to various cities to raise the money, he was left with 1 friend and 2 attendants among these Cilician pirates, who were notorious for their cruelty. Yet he treated them with such contempt that whenever he was lying down to rest, he would send to them and order them to be quiet. He spent 38 days among them, not so much like a prisoner as a prince surrounded by his guards, and he joined in their sports and exercises with perfect unconcern. He also wrote poems and some speeches which he read to them, and those who did not approve of his compositions he would call to their faces illiterate fellows and barbarians, and he would often tell them with a laugh that he would hang them all. The pirates were pleased with his manners, and attributed this freedom of speech to simplicity and mirthful disposition. As soon as the ransom came from Miletus and Caesar had paid it and was set at liberty, he manned some vessels in the port of Miletus and went after the pirates, whom he found still on the island, and he secured most of them. All their property he made his booty, but the pirates who lodged in prison at Pergamum, and then went to Junius, who as governor of the provinces of Asia was the proper person to punish the captives. But as the governor was casting a longing eye on the booty, which was valuable, and said he would take time to consider about the captives, Caesar, without more ado, left him, and going straight to Pergamum, took all the pirates out of prison and crucified them, as he had often told them he would do in the island, when they thought he was merely jesting. 3. Sulla's power was now declining, and Caesar's friends in Rome recommended him to return. However, he first made a voyage to Rhodes in order to have the instruction of Apollonius, the son of Molon, of whom Cicero also was a hearer. This Apollonius was a distinguished rhetorician and had the reputation of being a man of a good disposition. Caesar is said to have had a great talent for the composition of discourses on political matters, and to have cultivated it most diligently, so as to obtain, beyond dispute, the second rank. His ambition to be first in power and arms made him, from want of leisure, give up the first rank, to which his natural talents invited him, and consequently his attention to military matters and political affairs, by which he got the supreme power, did not allow him to attain perfection in oratory. Accordingly, at a later period, in his reply to Cicero about Cato, he deprecates all comparison between the composition of a soldier and the eloquence of an accomplished orator who had plenty of leisure to prosecute his studies. 4. On his return to Rome, he impeached Dolabella for maladministration in his province, and many of the cities of Greece gave evidence in support of the charge. Dolabella indeed was acquitted, but to make some return to the Greeks for their zeal in his behalf, Caesar assisted them in their prosecution of Publius Antonius for corruption before Marcus Lucullus, the governor of Macedonia. And his aid was so effectual that Antonius appealed to the tribunes, alleging that he had not a fair trial in Greece with the Greeks for his accusers. At Rome, Caesar got a brilliant popularity by aiding at trials with his eloquence, and he gained also much goodwill by his agreeable mode of saluting people and his pleasant manners, for he was more attentive to please than persons usually are at that age. He was also gradually acquiring political influence by the splendor of his entertainments and his table and of his general mode of living. At first, those who envied him, thinking that when his resources failed his influence would soon go, did not concern themselves about his flourishing popularity. But at last, when his political power had acquired strength and had become difficult to overthrow, and was manifestly tending to bring about a complete revolution, they perceived that no beginnings should be considered too small to be capable of quickly becoming great by uninterrupted endurance, and having no obstacle to their growth by reason of being despised. Cicero, who is considered to have been the first to suspect and to fear the smiling surface of Caesar's policy, as a man would the smiling smoothness of a sea, and who observed the bold and determined character which was concealed under a friendly and joyous exterior, said that in all his designs and public measures he perceived a tyrannical purpose. But on the other hand, said he, when I look at his hair, which is arranged with so much care, and see him scratching his head with one finger, I cannot think that such a wicked purpose will ever enter into this man's mind as the overthrow of the Roman state. This, however, belongs to a later period. 5. He received the first proof of the goodwill of the people towards him when he was a competitor against Gaius Popilius for a military tribuneship, and was proclaimed before him. He received a second and more conspicuous evidence of popular favor on the occasion of the death of Julia, the wife of Marius, when Caesar, who was her nephew, pronounced over her a splendid funeral oration in the Forum, and at the funeral ventured to exhibit the images of Marius, which were then seen for the first time since the administration of Sulla. For Marius and his son had been adjudged enemies. Some voices were raised against Caesar on account of this display, but the people responded by loud shouts and received him with clapping of hands and admiration that he was bringing back, as from the regions of Hades, after so long an interval, the glories of Marius to the city. Now it was an ancient Roman usage to pronounce funeral orations over elderly women, but it was not customary to do it in the case of young women, and Caesar set the first example by pronouncing a funeral oration over his deceased wife, which brought him some popularity and won the many by sympathy to consider him a man of a kind disposition and full of feeling. After the funeral of his wife, he went to Iberia as quaestor to the praetor Vetus, for whom he always showed great respect, and whose son he made his own quaestor when he filled the office of praetor. After his quaestorship, he married for his third wife Pompeia. He had by his wife Cornelia a daughter, who afterwards married Pompeius Magnus. Owing to his profuse expenditure, and indeed men generally suppose that he was buying at a great cost a short-lived popularity, though in fact he was purchasing things of the highest value at a low price, it is said that before he attained any public office, he was in debt to the amount of 1,300 talents. Upon being appointed curator of the Appian Road, he laid out upon it a large sum of his own, and during his aedileship he exhibited 320 pair of gladiators, and by his liberality and expenditure on the theatrical exhibitions, the processions, and the public entertainments, he completely drowned all previous displays, and put the people in such a humor that every man was seeking for new offices and new honors to requite him with. 6. There were at this time two parties in the state, that of Sulla, which was all-powerful, and that of Marius, which was cowed and divided and very feeble. It was Caesar's object to strengthen and gain over the party of Marius, and accordingly, when the ambitious splendor of his aedileship was at its height, he had images of Marius secretly made, and triumphal victories, which he took by night and set up on the Capitol. At daybreak, the people, seeing the images glittering with gold and exquisitely labored by art, and there were inscriptions also which declared the Cimbrian victories of Marius, were in admiration at the boldness of him who had placed them there, for it was no secret who it was, and the report quickly circulated through the city, brought everybody to the spot to see. Some exclaimed that Caesar had a design to make himself tyrant, which appeared by his reviving those testimonials of honor which had been buried in the earth by laws and decrees of the Senate, and that it was done to try if the people, who were already tampered with, were tamed to his purpose by his splendid exhibitions, and would allow him to venture on such tricks and innovations. But the partisans of Marius, encouraging one another, soon collected in surprising numbers, and filled the Capitol with their noise. Many also shed tears of joy at seeing the likeness of Marius, and Caesar was highly extolled as the only man worthy to be a kinsman of Marius. The Senate being assembled about these matters, Catulus Lutatius, who had at that time the greatest name of any man in Rome, got up, and charging Caesar, uttered that memorable expression, "Caesar, no longer are you taking the state by underground approaches, but by storming engines." Caesar spoke in reply to this charge, and satisfied the Senate, on which his admirers were still more elated, and urged him not to abate of his pretensions for anyone. With the favor of the people, they said, he would soon get the better of all, and be the first man in the state. 7. About this time, Metellus, the Pontifex Maximus, died, And though Isauricus and Catulus were candidates for the priesthood, which was a great object of ambition, and were men of the highest rank and greatest influence in the Senate, Caesar would not give way to them, but he presented himself to the people as a competitor. The favor of the people appearing equally divided, Catulus, as the more distinguished candidate, being more afraid of the uncertainty of the event, sent and offered Caesar a large sum of money if he would retire from his canvass. But Caesar replied that he would stand it out even if he had to borrow still more. On the day of the election, his mother with tears accompanied him to the door, when Caesar, embracing her, said, "Mother, today you shall see your son, either Pontifex Maximus or in exile." After the voting was over, which was conducted with great spirit, Caesar prevailed, a circumstance which alarmed the Senate and the nobles, who feared that he would lead on the people to the boldest measures. Accordingly, Piso and Catulus blamed Cicero for having spared Caesar, who in the matter of Catiline's conspiracy had given him a handle. Now Catiline designed not only to alter the form of government, but to subvert the whole commonwealth and throw all into confusion. But he was ejected from the city on being convicted of some minor charges, and before the extent of his designs was discovered, he left behind him in the city Lentulus and Cethegus to carry his plans into execution. It is uncertain if Caesar secretly lent them any countenance and aid, but when they were completely convicted in the Senate, and Cicero the consul put it to each senator to give his opinion on their punishment, all who spoke declared for death, till it came to Caesar's turn to speak. Caesar rose and delivered a studied oration, to the effect that it was not consistent with the constitution, nor was it just to put to death, without a trial, men distinguished for their high character and their family, unless there was the most urgent necessity. And he added that if they were imprisoned in the Italian cities which Cicero himself might choose, until the war against Catiline was brought to an end, the Senate might have time to deliberate on the case of each prisoner when peace was restored. 8. This proposal appeared so humane and was supported by so powerful a speech that not only those who rose after Caesar sided with him, but many of those who had already spoken changed their opinions and went over to that of Caesar, till it came to the turn of Cato and Catulus to speak. After they had made a vigorous opposition, and Cato in his speech had also urged suspicious matter against Caesar, and strongly argued against him, the conspirators were handed over to the executioner. And as Caesar was leaving the Senate, many of the young men, who then acted as a guard to Cicero, crowded together and threatened Caesar with their naked swords. But Curio is said to have thrown his toga round Caesar, and to have carried him off. And Cicero also, when the young men looked to him, is said to have checked them by emotion, either through fear of the people, or because he thought that the death of Caesar would be most unjust and a violation of law. If this is true, I cannot conceive why Cicero said nothing about it in the book on his consulship. But Cicero was blamed afterwards for not having taken advantage of so favorable an opportunity to get rid of Caesar, and for having feared the people, who were extravagantly attached to Caesar. And indeed, a few days after, when Caesar had gone to the Senate and defended himself in a speech against the imputations that had been cast on him, and his speech was received with loud marks of disapprobation, and the sitting of the Senate was lasting longer than usual, the people came with loud cries and surrounded the Senate house, calling for Caesar and bidding the Senate let him go. Accordingly, Cato, apprehending danger mainly from some movement of the needy part of the people, who were like a firebrand among the rest of the citizens, as they had all their hopes in Caesar, prevailed on the Senate to give them a monthly allowance of corn, which produced an addition to the rest of the expenditure of 7,500,000. However, the immediate alarm was manifestly quenched by this measure, which snapped off the best part of Caesar's influence and scattered it, at a time when he was going to enter on his office of praetor, which made him more formidable. 9. No tumults occurred in Caesar's praetorship, but a disagreeable incident happened in his family. Publius Clodius, a man of patrician rank, was distinguished both by wealth and eloquence, but in arrogance and impudence he was not inferior to the most notorious scoundrels in Rome. Clodius was in love with Pompeia, Caesar's wife, and Pompeia was in no way averse to him. But a strict watch was kept over the woman's apartment, and Aurelia, Caesar's mother, who was a prudent woman, by always observing Pompeia, made it difficult and hazardous for the lovers to have an interview. Now the Romans have a goddess, whom they call Bona, as the Greeks have a Gynecia. The Phrygians who claim this goddess say she was the mother of King Midas. The Romans say she was a dryad and the wife of Faunus, but the Greeks say she is one of the mothers of Dionysus, whose name must not be uttered. And this is the reason why they cover the tents with vine leaves during the celebration of her festival, and a sacred serpent sits by the goddess according to the mythus. No man is allowed to approach the festival, nor to be in the house during the celebration of the rites. But the women by themselves are said to perform many rites similar to the Orphic in the celebration. Accordingly, when the season of the festival is come, the husband, if he be consul or praetor, leaves the house, and every male also quits it. And the wife, taking possession of the house, makes all arrangements, and the chief ceremonies are celebrated by night, the evening festival being accompanied with mirth and much music. 10. While Pompeia was now celebrating this festival, Clodius, who was not yet bearded, and for this reason thought that he should not be discovered, assumed the dress and equipment of a female lute player, and went to the house looking just like a young woman. Finding the door open, he was safely led in by a female slave who was in the secret, and who forthwith ran off to tell Pompeia. As there was some delay, and Clodius was too impatient to wait where the woman had left him, but was rambling about the house, which was large, and trying to avoid the lights, Aurelia's waiting woman, as was natural for one woman with another, challenged him to a little mirthful sport. And as he declined the invitations, she pulled him forward and asked who he was and where he came from. Clodius replied that he was waiting for Abra, the maid of Pompeia, for that was the woman's name. But his voice betrayed him, and the waiting woman ran with a loud cry to the lights and the rest of the company, calling out that she had discovered a man. All the women were in the greatest alarm, and Aurelia stopped the celebration of the rites and covered up the sacred things. She also ordered the doors to be closed and went about the house with the lights to look for Clodius. He was discovered, lurking in the chamber of the girl who had let him in, and on being recognized by the women, was turned out of doors. The women went straightway, though it was night, to their husbands, to tell them what had happened. And as soon as it was day, the talk went through Rome of the desecration of the sacred rites by Clodius, and how he ought to be punished for his behavior, not only to the persons whom he had insulted, but to the city and the gods. Accordingly, one of the tribunes instituted a prosecution against Clodius for an offense against religion, and the most powerful of the senators combined against him, charging him, among other abominations, with adultery with his sister, who was the wife of Lucullus. The people set themselves in opposition to their exertions and supported Clodius, and were of great service to him with the Judases, who were terror-struck and afraid of the people. Caesar immediately divorced Pompeia, and when he was summoned as a witness on the trial, he said he knew nothing about the matters that Clodius was charged with. This answer appearing strange, the accuser asked him, "Why have you put away your wife?" To which Caesar replied, "Because I considered that my wife ought not even to be suspected." Some say that this was the real expression of Caesar's opinion, but others affirm that it was done to please the people who were bent on saving Clodius. However this may be, Clodius was acquitted, for the majority of the Judases gave in their votes, written confusedly, that they might run no risk from the populace by convicting Clodius, nor lose the good opinion of the better sort by acquitting him. 11. On the expiration of his praetorship, Caesar received Iberia for his province, but as he had a difficulty about arranging matters with his creditors, who put obstructions in the way of his leaving Rome and were clamorous, he applied to Crassus, then the richest man in Rome, who stood in need of the vigor and impetuosity of Caesar to support him in his political hostility to Pompeius. Crassus undertook to satisfy the most importunate and unrelenting of the creditors, and having become security for Caesar to the amount of 830 talents, thus enabled him to set out for his province. There is a story that as Caesar was crossing the Alps, he passed by a small barbarian town, which had very few inhabitants and was a miserable place, on which his companions jocosely observed, "They did not suppose there were any contests for honors in such a place as that, and struggles for the first rank and mutual jealousy of the chief persons," on which Caesar earnestly remarked, "I would rather be the first man here than the second at Rome." Again in Spain, when he had some leisure and was reading the history of Alexander, he was for a long time in deep thought, and at last burst into tears. And on his friends asking the reason of this, he said, "Don't you think it is a matter for sorrow that Alexander was king of so many nations at such an early age, and I have as yet done nothing of note?" 12. However, as soon as he entered Iberia, he commenced active operations, and in a few days raised 10 cohorts in addition to the 20 which were already there, and with this force marching against the Calaci, the Lusitani, he defeated them, and advanced to the shores of the external sea, subduing the nations which hitherto had paid no obedience to Rome. After his military success, he was equally fortunate in settling the civil administration by establishing friendly relations among the different states, and particularly by healing the differences between debtors and creditors, for which purpose he determined that the creditor should annually take 2/3 of the debtor's income, and that the owner should take the other third, which arrangement was to continue till the debt was paid. By these measures he gained a good reputation, and he retired from the province with the acquisition of a large fortune, having enriched his soldiers also by his campaigns, and been saluted by them Imperator. 13. As it was the law at Rome that those who were soliciting a triumph should stay outside the city, and that those who were candidates for the consulship should be present in the city, Caesar, finding himself in this difficulty and having reached Rome just at the time of the consular elections, sent to the Senate to request permission to offer himself to the consulship in his absence through the intervention of his friends. Cato at first urged the law in opposition to Caesar's request, but seeing that many of the senators had been gained over by Caesar, he attempted to elude the question by taking advantage of time and wasting the day in talking, till at last Caesar determined to give up the triumph and to secure the consulship. As soon as he entered the city, he adopted a policy which deceived everybody except Cato, and this was the bringing about of a reconciliation between Pompeius and Crassus, the two most powerful men in Rome, whom Caesar reconciled from their differences, and centering in himself the united strength of the two by an act that had a friendly appearance, changed the form of government without its being observed. For it was not, as most people suppose, the enmity of Caesar and Pompeius which produced the civil wars, but their friendship rather, inasmuch as they first combined to depress the nobility and then quarreled with one another. Cato, who often predicted what would happen, at the time only got by it the character of being a morose, meddling fellow, though afterwards he was considered to be a wise but not a fortunate advisor. 14. Caesar, however, supported on both sides by the friendship of Crassus and Pompeius, was raised to the consulship and proclaimed triumphantly with Calpurnius Bibulus for his colleague. Immediately upon entering on his office, he proposed enactments more suitable to the most turbulent tribune than a consul, for in order to please the populace, he introduced measures for certain allotments and divisions of land. But he met with opposition in the Senate for the good and honorable among them, and as he had long been looking for a pretext, he exclaimed, with solemn adjurations, that he was driven against his will to court the favor of the people by the arrogance and obstinacy of the Senate. And accordingly, he hurried to the popular assembly, and placing Crassus on one side of him and Pompeius on the other, he asked them if they approved of his legislative measures. Upon their expressing their approbation, he entreated them to give him their aid against those who threatened to oppose him with their swords. Pompeius and Crassus promised their assistance, and Pompeius added that he would oppose swords with his sword and shield. The nobility were annoyed at hearing such mad, inconsiderate words dropped from Pompeius, which were unbecoming his own character and the respect that he owed to the Senate. But the people were delighted. Caesar, whose secret design it was to secure the influence of Pompeius still more, gave him to wife his daughter Julia, who was already betrothed to Servilius Caepio, and he promised Caepio that he should have the daughter of Pompeius, though she also was not disengaged, being betrothed to Faustus, the son of Sulla. Shortly after, Caesar married Calpurnia, the daughter of Piso, and got Piso named consul for the next year, though Cato in this matter also strongly protested, and exclaimed that it was an intolerable thing for the chief power to be prostituted by marriage bargains, and that they should help one another by means of women to provinces and armies and political power. Bibulus, Caesar's colleague, found it useless to oppose Caesar's measures, and he and Cato several times narrowly escaped with their lives in the Forum, whereupon Bibulus shut himself up at home for the remainder of his consulship. Immediately after his marriage, Pompeius filled the Forum with armed men, and supported the people in passing Caesar's laws, and in giving him for 5 years Gaul on both sides of the Alps, with the addition of Illyricum and 4 legions. Upon Cato's venturing to speak against these measures, Caesar ordered him to be carried off to prison, thinking that he would appeal to the tribunes. But Cato went off without speaking a word, and Caesar, observing that the nobles were much annoyed at this, and the people also, through respect for Cato's virtue, were following him in silence and with downcast eyes, secretly asked one of the tribunes to release Cato. Very few of the senators used to accompany Caesar to the Senate, but the majority, not liking his measures, stayed away. Considius, who was a very old man, observed that the senators did not come because they were afraid of the arms and the soldiers. "Why don't you then stay at home for the same reason?" replied Caesar. To which Considius rejoined, "My age makes me fearless, for the little of life that remains for me is not worth much thought." The most scandalous public measure in Caesar's consulship was the election as tribune of that Clodius, who had dishonored Caesar's wife and violated the mysterious nocturnal rites. But he was elected in order to ruin Cicero, and Caesar did not set out for his province till with the aid of Clodius he had put down Cicero by his cabals and driven him out of Italy. 15. Such is said to have been the course of Caesar's life before his Gallic campaigns, but the period of his wars which he afterwards fought, and his expedition by which he subdued Gaul, is just like a new beginning in his career, and the commencement of a new course of life and action, in which he showed himself as a soldier, and a general inferior to none, who have gained admiration as leaders, and been the greatest men. For whether we compare Caesar's exploits with those of the Fabii, Scipios, and Metelli, or with those of his contemporaries or immediate predecessors, Sulla and Marius, and both the Luculae, or even Pompeius himself, whose fame, high as the heavens, was blossoming at that time in every kind of military virtue, Caesar will be found to surpass them all. His superiority over one appearing in the difficulties of the country in which he carried on his campaigns, over another in the extent of country subdued, over a third in the number and courage of the enemy whom he defeated, over another again in the savage manners and treacherous character of the nations that he brought to civility, over a fourth in his clemency and mildness to the conquered, over another again in his donations and liberality to his soldiers, and in fine, his superiority over all other generals appears by the numbers of battles that he fought and of enemies that he slew. For in somewhat less than 10 years during which he carried on his campaign in Gaul, he took by storm above 800 cities, and subdued 300 nations, and fought with 3 millions of men at different times, of whom he destroyed 1 million in battle, and took as many prisoners. 16. So great were the goodwill and devotion of Caesar's soldiers to him, that those who under other generals were in no way superior to ordinary soldiers were invincible and irresistible, and ready to meet any danger for Caesar's glory. An instance of this is Achilles, who in the sea fight at Massalia boarded one of the enemy's ships, and had his right hand cut off with a sword. But he still kept hold of his shield with the left hand, and striking at the faces of the enemy, drove all to flight, and got possession of the vessel. Another instance was Cassius Sceva, who in the fight at Dyrrachium had one eye destroyed by an arrow, his shoulder transfixed with one javelin, and his thigh with another, and on his shield he had received the blows of 130 missiles. In this plight, he called to the enemy, as if he designed to surrender himself, and 2 of them accordingly approached him. But with his sword, he lopped off one man's shoulder, and wounding the other in the face, put him to flight. And finally, he escaped himself with the aid of his friends. In Britannia, on one occasion, the natives had attacked the foremost centurions, who had got into a marshy spot full of water, upon which, in the presence of Caesar, who was viewing the contest, a soldier rushed into the midst of the enemy, and after performing many conspicuous acts of valor, rescued the centurions from the barbarians who took to flight. The soldier, with difficulty attempting to cross after all the rest, plunged into the muddy stream, and with great trouble and the loss of his shield, sometimes swimming, sometimes walking, he got safe over. While those who were about Caesar were admiring his conduct and coming to receive him with congratulations and shouts, the soldier, with the greatest marks of dejection and tears in his eyes, fell down at Caesar's feet and begged pardon for the loss of his shield. Again, in Libya, Scipio's party, having taken one of Caesar's ships, in which was Granius Petro, who had been appointed quaestor, made booty of all the rest, but offered to give the quaestor his life. But he, replying that it was the fashion with Caesar's soldiers to give and not to accept mercy, killed himself with his own sword. 17. This courage and emulation Caesar cherished and created, in the first place by distributing rewards and honors without stint, and thus showing that he did not get wealth from the enemy for his own enjoyment and pleasure, but that it was treasured up with him as the common reward of courage, and that he was rich only in proportion as he rewarded deserving soldiers. And in the next place, by readily undergoing every danger and never shrinking from any toil. Now, they did not so much admire Caesar's courage, knowing his love of glory, but his endurance of labor, beyond his body's apparent power of sustaining it, was a matter of astonishment. For he was of a spare habit, and had a white and soft skin, and was subject to complaints in the head, and to epileptic fits, which, as it is said, first attacked him at Corduba. Notwithstanding all this, he did not make his feeble health an excuse for indulgence, but he made military service the means of his cure, by unwearied journeying, frugal diet, and by constantly keeping in the open air and enduring fatigue, struggling with his malady and keeping his body proof against its attacks. He generally slept in chariots or in litters, making even his repose a kind of action. And in the daytime, he used to ride in a vehicle to the garrisons, cities, and camps, with a slave by his side, one of those who were expert at taking down what was dictated on a journey, and a single soldier behind him armed with a sword. He used to travel so quick on his first journey from Rome he reached the Rhodanus in 8 days. From his boyhood he was a good horseman, for he had been accustomed to place his hands behind him and holding them close together on his back to put the horse to his full speed. In that campaign, he also practiced himself in dictating letters as he was riding, and thus giving employment to 2 scribes, and as Oppius says, to more. He is said also to have introduced the practice of communicating with his friends by letters, as there was no time for personal interviews on urgent affairs, owing to the amount of business and the size of the city. This anecdote also is cited as a proof of his indifference as to diet. On one occasion, when he was entertained at supper by his host Valerius Leo, in Mediolanum, asparagus was served up, with mirum poured on it instead of oil, which Caesar ate, without taking any notice of it, and reproved his friends who were out of humor on the occasion. "You should be content," he said, "not to eat what you don't like. But to find fault with your host's ill-breeding is to be as ill-bred as himself." Once upon a journey he was compelled by a storm to take shelter in a poor man's hut, which contained only a single chamber, and that hardly large enough for one person, on which he observed to his friends that the post of honor must be given to the worthiest and the place of safety to the weakest. And he bade Oppius lie down, while he and the rest slept in the porch. 18. Caesar's first Gallic campaign was against the Helvetii in Tiguriani, who had burnt their cities, 12 in number, and their villages, of which there were 400, and were advancing through that part of Gaul, which was subject to the Romans, like the Cimbri and Teutones of old, to whom they were considered to be not inferior in courage and in numbers equal, being in all 300,000, of whom 190,000 were fighting men. The Tigurini were not opposed by Caesar in person, but by Blabinus, who was sent against them by Caesar, and totally defeated them near the Arar. The Helvetii fell on Caesar unexpectedly, as he was leading his forces to a friendly city. But he succeeded in making his way to a strong position, where he rallied his army and prepared for battle. A horse being brought to him, he said, "I shall want this for the pursuit after I have defeated the enemy. But let us now move on against them." And accordingly he made the charge on foot. After a long and difficult contest, the Helvetian warriors were driven back. But the hardest struggle was about the chariots and the camp, for the Helvetians made a stand there, and a desperate resistance, and also their wives and children, who fought till they were cut to pieces, and the battle was hardly over at midnight. This glorious deed of victory Caesar followed up by one still better, for he brought together those who had escaped from the battle and compelled them to reoccupy the tract which they had left, and to rebuild the cities which they had destroyed. And the number of these was above 100,000. His object in this measure was to prevent the Germans from crossing the Rhenus and occupying the vacant country. 19. His next contest was with the Germans, and for the immediate defense of the Gauls, although he had before this made an alliance with their king, Ariovistus, in Rome. But the Germans were intolerable neighbors to Caesar's subjects, and if opportunity offered, it was supposed that they would not remain satisfied with what they had, but would invade and occupy Gaul. Caesar, observing his officers afraid of the approaching contest, and particularly the men of rank and the youths who had joined him in the expectation of finding a campaign with Caesar a matter of pleasure and profit, called them to a public assembly, and bade them leave him, and not fight against their inclination, since they were so cowardly and effeminate. As for himself, he said he would take the 10th Legion by itself and lead it against the enemy, knowing that he should not have to deal with a braver enemy than the Cimbri, and that he was not a worse general than Marius. Upon this, the 10th Legion sent a deputation of their body to thank him, but the rest of the legions abused their own officers, and the whole army, full of impetuosity and eagerness, all followed Caesar, marching for many days, till they encamped within 200 stadia of the enemy. The courage of Ariovistus was somewhat broken by the bare approach of the Romans, for as he had supposed that the Romans would not stand the attack of the Germans, and he never expected that they would turn assailants, he was amazed at Caesar's daring, and he also saw that his own army was disturbed. The spirit of the Germans was still more blunted by the predictions of their wise women, who, observing the eddies in the rivers and drawing signs from the whirlings and noise of the waters, foreboded the future and declared that the army ought not to fight before it was new moon. Caesar, hearing of this and perceiving that the Germans were inactive, thought it a good opportunity for engaging with them, while they were out of spirits instead of sitting still and waiting for their time. By attacking their fortifications and the hills on which they were encamped, he irritated the Germans and provoked them to come down in passion and fight. The Germans were completely routed and pursued to the Rhenus, a distance of 400 stadia, and the whole of this space was strewed with dead bodies and arms. Ariovistus with a few escaped across the river. The dead are said to have been 80,000 in number. 20. After these exploits, he left his forces among the Sequani to winter, and with the view of attending to what was going on at Rome, came down to Gaul about the Padus, which was a part of his province. For the river Rubicon separates the rest of Italy from Gaul beneath the Alps. Fixing his residence there, he carried on his political intrigues, and many persons came to visit him to whom he gave what they asked for, and he dismissed all, either with their wishes satisfied or with hopes. During the whole period of his government in Gaul, he conducted his operations without attracting any attention from Pompeius, though at one time he was subduing the enemy by the arms of the citizens, and at another, capturing and subjugating the citizens of the money which he got from the enemy. Hearing that the Belgae had risen in arms, who were the most powerful nation of the Gauls, and in possession of a third part of all Gaul, and that they had assembled many 10,000s of armed men, he immediately turned about and went against them with all possible expedition. And falling upon the enemy, while they were plundering the Gauls who were in alliance with the Romans, he put to flight and destroyed those who were collected in greatest numbers, and the chief part of them, after an unsuccessful resistance. And such was the slaughter that the Romans crossed the lakes and deep rivers over the dead bodies. Of the rebels, all who dwelt near the ocean surrendered without resistance. But against the fiercest and most warlike of those in these parts, the Nervii, Caesar led his forces. The Nervii, who inhabited the dense thickets and had placed their families and property in a deep recess of the forest, as far as possible from the enemy, suddenly, to the number of 60,000, attacked Caesar while he was fortifying his camp, and not expecting a battle. And they put the Roman cavalry to flight, and surrounding the 12th and 7th legions, killed all the centurions. If Caesar had not seized a shield, and making his way through the first ranks charged the barbarians, and if the 10th legion had not run down from the heights to support him when he was in danger of being overpowered, and broken the ranks of the enemy, it is supposed that not a single Roman would have escaped. Encouraged by Caesar's intrepidity, the Romans fought, as the saying is, beyond their strength, but yet they could not put the Nervii to flight, who defeated themselves till they were cut to pieces. Out of 60,000, only 500 are said to have escaped, and 3 senators out of the 400. 21. The Senate, on receiving intelligence of this victory, decreed that for 15 days there should be sacrifices to the gods, and cessation from all business, with feasting, which had never been done before for so long a time. For the danger was considered to have been great, so many nations having broken out at once. And because Caesar was the conqueror, the goodwill of the many towards him made the victory more splendid. And accordingly, having settled affairs in Gaul, he again spent the winter in the plain of the Padus, and employed himself in intriguing at Rome. Not only the candidates for the offices of the state carried their elections by Caesar, supplying them with money, which they spent in bribing the people, and directed all their measures to the increase of Caesar's power, but the greater part of the Romans most distinguished for rank and political power came to see him at Lucca. Pompeius and Crassus, and Appius, the governor of Sardinia, and Nepos, proconsul of Iberia, so that there were 120 lictors there, and more than 200 senators. Their deliberations resulted in this. It was agreed that Pompeius and Crassus should be made consuls, and that Caesar should have an allowance of money and 5 additional years in his province, which to all reflecting people seemed the most extravagant thing of all. For those who were receiving so much from Caesar urged the Senate to grant him money, as if he had none, or rather compelled the Senate to do it, groaning as it were over its own decrees. Cato, indeed, was not present, for he had been purposely sent out of the way on a mission to Cyprus, and Favonius, who affected to imitate Cato, finding he could do nothing by his opposition, hastily left the Senate and began to clamor to the people. But nobody attended to him, some from fear of displeasing Pompeius and Crassus, but the greater part kept quiet to please Caesar, living on hopes from him. 22. Caesar again returned to his troops in Gaul, where he found much war in the country, for 2 great German nations had just crossed the Rhunus for the purpose of getting land. The one nation was called Usippus, and the other Tentirite. Respecting the battle with them, Caesar says in his commentaries that the barbarians, while they were treating with him during a truce, attacked on their march, and so put to flight his own cavalry to the number of 5,000, with 800 of their own. For his men were not expecting an attack. That they then sent other ambassadors to him, intending to deceive him again, whom he detained, and then led his army against the barbarians, considering all faith towards such faithless men and violators of truces to be folly. But Tanusius says that while the Senate were decreeing festivals and sacrifices for the victory, Cato delivered it as his opinion that they ought to give up Caesar to the barbarians, and so purge themselves of the violation of the truce on behalf of the city, and turn the curse on the guilty man. Of those who had crossed the river, there were slaughtered to the number of 400,000, and the few who recrossed the river were received by the Sugambri, a German tribe. Caesar, laying hold of this ground of complaint against the Germans, and being also greedy of glory, and desirous to be the first man to cross the Rhunus with an army, began to build a bridge over the river, which was very broad, and in this part of the bed spread out widest, and was rough and ran with a strong current, so as to drive the trunks of trees that were carried down, and logs of wood against the supports of the bridge, and tear them asunder. But Caesar planted large timbers across the bed of the river, above the bridge, to receive the trees that floated down, and thus bridling the descending current, beyond all expectations, he accomplished the completion of the bridge in 10 days. 23. Caesar now led his troops over the river, no one venturing to oppose him, and even the Suevi, The most valiant of the Germans retired with their property into deep woody valleys. After devastating with fire the enemy's country and encouraging all those who favored the Romans, he returned into Gaul after spending 18 days in Germany. His expedition against the Britanni was notorious for its daring, for he was the first who entered the Western Ocean with an armament and sailed through the Atlantic Sea, leading an army to war. And by attempting to occupy an island of incredible magnitude, which furnished matter for much dispute to numerous writers, who affirmed that the name and the accounts about it were pure inventions, for it never had existed and did not then exist, he extended the Roman supremacy beyond the inhabited world. After twice crossing over to the island from the opposite coast of Gaul, and worsting the enemy in many battles, rather than advantaging his own men, for there was nothing worth taking from men who lived so wretched a life and were so poor, he brought the war to a close, not such as he wished, but taking hostages from the king and imposing a tribute, he retired from the island. On his return, he found letters which were just going to cross over to him from his friends in Rome, informing him of his daughter's death, who died in childbirth in the house of her husband Pompeius. Great was the grief of Pompeius, and great was the grief of Caesar. And their friends were also troubled, as the relationship was now dissolved, which maintained peace and concord in the state, which but for this alliance was threatened with disturbance. The child also died after surviving the mother only a few days. Now the people, in spite of the tribunes, carried Julia to the field of Mars, where her obsequies were celebrated, and there she lies. 24. As the force of Caesar was now large, he was obliged to distribute it in many winter encampments. But while he was on his road to Italy, according to his custom, there was another general rising of the Gauls, and powerful armies scouring the country attempted to destroy the winter camps and attacked the Roman entrenchments. The most numerous and bravest of the revolted Gauls under Aubrey destroyed Cotta and Titurius with their army, and the legion under Cicero they surrounded with 60,000 men and blockaded, and they came very near taking the camp by storm, for all the Romans had been wounded and were courageously defending themselves above their strength. When this intelligence reached Caesar, who was at a distance, he quickly turned about, and getting together 7,000 men in all, he hurried to release Cicero from the blockade. The besiegers were aware of his approach, and met him with the intention of cutting him off at once, for they despised the fewness of his numbers. But Caesar, deceiving the enemy, avoided them continually, and having occupied a position which was advantageous to one who had to contend against many with a small force, he fortified his camp, and kept his men altogether from fighting. And he made them increase the height of the ramparts, and build up the gates, as if they were afraid, his maneuver being to make the enemy despise him, till at last, when they made their assault in scattered bodies, urged by self-confidence, sallying out, he put them to flight, and killed many of them. 25. The frequent defections of the Gauls in those parts were thus quieted, and also by Caesar during the winter, moving about in all directions, and carefully watching disturbances. For there had come to him from Italy 3 legions to replace those that had perished, Pompeius having lent him 2 of those which were under his command, and 1 legion having been newly raised in Gaul upon the Padus. But in the course of time, there showed themselves what had long in secret been planted, and spread abroad by the most powerful men among the most warlike tribes, the elements of the greatest and the most dangerous of all the wars in Gaul, strengthened by a numerous body of young men, armed and collected from all quarters, and by great stores brought together, and fortified cities and countries difficult of access. And at that time, during the winter, frozen rivers and forests buried in snow, and plains overflowed by winter torrents, and in some parts paths that could not be discovered for the depth of the snow, and in other parts the great uncertainty of a march through marshes and streams diverted from their course seemed to place the proceedings of the insurgents altogether beyond any attempt on the part of Caesar. Accordingly, many tribes had revolted, but the leaders of the revolt were the Arverni and the Carnuntinii. Vercingetorix was elected to the supreme direction of the war, he whose father the Gauls had put to death on the ground of aiming at a tyranny. 26. Vercingetorix, dividing his force into many parts and placing over them many commanders, began to gain over all the surrounding country, as far as those who bordered on the Arar, it being his design, as Caesar's enemies in Rome were combining against him, to rouse all Gaul to war. If he had attempted this a little later, when Caesar was engaged in the civil war, alarms no less than those from the invasion of the Cimbri would have seized on Italy. But now Caesar, who appears to have had the talent for making the best use of all opportunities in war, and particularly critical seasons, as soon as he heard of the rising, set out on his march by the very roads that he traversed, and the impetuosity and rapidity of his march in so severe a winter, letting the barbarians see that an invincible and unvanquished army was coming against them. For where no one believed that a messenger or a letter carrier from him could make his way in a long time, there was Caesar seen with all his army, at once ravaging their lands and destroying their forts, taking cities, and receiving those who changed sides and came over to him, till at last even the nation of the Aedui declared against him, who up to this time had called themselves brothers of the Romans and had received signal distinction. But now, by joining the insurgents that greatly dispirited Caesar's troops. In consequence of this, Caesar moved from those parts and passed over the territory of the Lingones, wishing to join the Sequani, who were friends, and formed a bulwark in front of Italy against the rest of Gaul. There the enemy fell upon him and hemmed him in with many 10,000s, upon which Caesar resolved to fight a decisive battle against the combined forces, and after a great contest he gained a victory at last, and with great slaughter routed the barbarians. But at first it appears that he sustained some loss, and the Arverni show a dagger suspended in a temple, which they say was taken from Caesar. Caesar himself afterwards saw it and smiled, and when his friends urged him to take it down, he would not, because he considered it consecrated. 27. However, the chief part of those who then escaped fled with the king to the city of Alesia, and while Caesar was besieging this city, which was considered to be impregnable by reason of the strength of the walls and the number of the defenders, there fell upon him from without a danger great beyond all expectation. For the strength of all the nations in Gaul assembling in arms came against Alesia, to the number of 300,000. and the fighting men in the city were not fewer than 170,000, so that Caesar, being caught between two such forces and blockaded, was compelled to form two walls for his protection, the one towards the city, and the other opposite those who had come upon him, since if these forces should unite, his affairs would be entirely ruined. On many accounts then, and with good reason, the hazard before the walls of Alesia was famed abroad as having produced deeds of daring and skill, such as no other struggle had done. But it is most worthy of admiration that Caesar engaged with so many thousands outside of the town, and defeated them, without it being known to those in the city. And still more admirable, that this was also unknown to the Romans who were guarding the wall towards the city. For they knew nothing of the victory till they heard the weeping of the men in Alesia, and the wailing of the women, when they saw on the other side many shields adorned with silver and gold, and many breastplates smeared with blood, and also cups and Gallic tents conveyed by the Romans to their camp. So quickly did so mighty a force, like a phantom or a dream, vanish out of sight and disperse, the greater part of the men having fallen in battle. But those who held Alesia, after giving no small trouble to themselves and to Caesar, at last surrendered. And the leader of the whole war, Vercingetorix, putting on his best armor, and equipping his horse, came out through the gates, and riding round Caesar who was seated, and then leaping down from his horse, he threw off his complete armor, and seating himself at Caesar's feet, he remained there till he was delivered up to be kept for the triumph.